pull up the PowerPoint here. So just trying to share my screen here. So can you guys see that? Does it look right? All right. So basically here, one more second. All right, so I can see my other screen. Okay, so basically we're going to pick up the story of Saul and David in 1 Samuel chapter 20. So if you were with us for our previous couple sessions on this, we finished off last time at the end of chapter 19, and it was the record of Saul sending his messengers to go and kind of capture David and bring him back. But God intervened miraculously, and then Saul himself, he got tired of his messengers not being able to bring David back, so he went himself, and he also experienced the intervention of God as he basically started prophesying on his way. And when he came before Samuel, when he arrived to the place, he basically fell down and was prophesying and wasn't able to capture David and bring him back like he was originally wanting to. So basically that allowed David to escape Saul's evil intention plans for him. So that's kind of where we're picking things up now. So that's just a little brief recap. Okay, so starting in 1 Samuel 20, right at the beginning, and I believe this is from the New American Standard that I've got up here, but follow along in your own version, in your own Bibles, if you'd like to. If not, you can just read what we have up here on the screen. But starting at verse 1, 1 Samuel 20 says, "Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said to Jonathan, 'What have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father that he is seeking my life?' And he said to him, 'Far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so.' David vowed again, saying, 'Your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight.' And he has said, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death.' Then Jonathan said to David, 'Whatever you say, I will do for you.'" Okay, so even with the supernatural intervention to stop Saul from harming David that we read about in chapter 19, David still realized that he's in danger, and he continued to flee from Saul. He seems to get the idea that Saul's not just going to say, "Oh, I must be wrong. Look, God's intervening to protect David from me getting him." And he basically, David sees that Saul's not going to repent at this point and change his way. So he continues to flee away, and he goes to Jonathan's his dear friend, his brother-in-law, and he's Saul's oldest son. So he asked him, he said, "Why is basically Saul so adamantly trying to kill him?" Jonathan was in line to be king after Saul, but he wasn't worried about that. He wasn't envious about David, and he agrees to help David because he is his, dear friend. And, their brother-in-laws, they're very close. Continuing on at verse 5. "So David said to Jonathan, 'Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I ought to sit down with the king, or sit down to eat with the king. But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field until the third evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family. If he says, it is good, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, know that he has decided on evil. Therefore, deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there is iniquity in me, put me to death yourself. For why then should you bring me to your father?' Jonathan said, 'Far be it from you. For if I should indeed learn that evil has been decided by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you about it?' Then David said to Jonathan, who will tell me if your father answers you harshly?" Jonathan said to David, "Come, let us go out into the field." So both of them went out to the field. So here we see, David knows the evil that Saul has intention towards him. Jonathan, however, was not convinced yet of Saul's evil plans for David. So here we kind of read that, David and Saul, they decided to kind of work out this plan to test Saul and see if he was planning evil towards David or not. So we're going to go out in the field to kind of discuss a plan here. Picking up at verse 12, then Jonathan said to David, "The Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if there is a good feeling toward David, shall I not then send to you and make it known to you? If it please my father to do you harm, may the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not make it known to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. And may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies." Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, and because he loved him as he loved his own life. Then Jonathan said to him, "Tomorrow is the new moon, and you will be missed because your seat will be empty. When you have stayed for 3 days, you shall go down quickly and come to the place where you hid yourself on that eventful day, and you shall remain by the stone of Ezel, and I will shoot 3 arrows to the side as though I shot at a target. And behold, I will send a lad saying, 'Go find the arrows.' If I specifically say to the lad, 'Behold, the arrows are on this side of you, get them, then come, for there is safety for you and no harm, as the Lord lives.' But if I say to the youth, 'Behold, the arrows are beyond you,' go, for the Lord has sent you away. As for the agreement of which you and I have spoken, behold, the Lord is between you and me forever." So Jonathan and David here, they kind of come up with this clever plan that would allow Jonathan to pass a message to David about what his father's intentions were without it being known to others. So basically, he's going to go out there, shoot some arrows, and send this guy out to go gather them. And if he says, "Hey, they're beyond you, go further," David's going to hear that and know to take off, that he's in danger. But if it's like, "Nope, come closer, they're over here," he's going to say, "Okay, it's safe. And he's going to head in to go visit with Saul, Jonathan. All right. So picking it up now in verse 24. So David hid in the field, and when the new moon came, the king sat down to eat food, and the king sat at his seat as usual, the seat by the wall. Then Jonathan rose up, and Abner sat down by Saul's side, but David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not speak anything that day, for he thought, "It's an accident. He's not clean. Surely he's not clean." It came about the next day, the second day of the new moon, that David's was empty. So Saul said to Jonathan his son, "Why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal, either yesterday or today?" Jonathan then answered Saul, "David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem, for he said, 'Please let me go, since our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to attend. And now, if I have found favor in your sight, please let me get away that I may see my brothers.' For this reason, he has not come to the king's table." Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now send and bring him to me, for he must surely die." But Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Then Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him down. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. Then Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger, and he did not eat food on the second day of the new moon, for he was grieved over David because his father had dishonored him. So Jonathan here, he follows this plan that he and David had come up with, and Saul, when he notices that he's not there, he inquired of him, why is David's not at the meal? Jonathan kind of tells him this lie that they just devised to test him and see what his plans were. And he told him that, the excuse of, why David's not there. And then Saul, gets very angry here. He basically confronts Jonathan for helping David. I think it's interesting here that he goes so far as to insult Jonathan's mother, even though this is Saul's son, and as well, he blames it on the mother. Of course, it's not Saul's fault that his son is acting this way; it's his mother's fault. So that's a interesting thing here. But basically, he brings up, that David is this threat to Jonathan being the successor to the throne. And then what really things go awry here is when then Saul kind of challenges, or when Jonathan is challenging Saul here, he says, what's he done? He shouldn't be, why is he putting him to death? He's not done anything wrong. Saul gets so angered that he throws the spear at his own son, Jonathan here. If we remember, he threw the spear at David. So, Saul's got this kind of rage, anger problem that continues to come up, but gets to the point where he just tries to, throw a spear and kill somebody when he gets upset. So you can see why David wasn't really wanting to be here at this meal. All right, so we're going to go down to verse 35 now. Now it came about in the morning that Jonathan went into the field for the appointment with David. And the little lad was with him. And he said to the lad, "Run, find now the arrows which I'm about to shoot." And as the lad was running, he shot an arrow past him. And the lad reached the place of the arrow which Jonathan had shot. And Jonathan called after the lad and said, "Is not the arrow beyond you?" And Jonathan called after the lad, "Hurry, be quick, do not stay." And Jonathan's lad picked up the arrow and came to his master. But the lad was not aware of anything. Only Jonathan and David knew about the matter. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to the lad and said to him, "Go, bring them to the city." And when the lad had gone, David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. And they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the more. Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever.'" Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. So Jonathan here followed the plan to warn David of Saul's intent to kill him. And I think the idea originally was that David could just hear that message and then run and disappear. But, instead of that, just passing the secret message, he goes even further. Jonathan does, and he sends away his servant so he can meet with David in person, kind of send him off and tell him goodbye and such. So after what we read here is a pretty emotional interaction. David ends up leaving the area to escape the danger, while Jonathan remained behind. Okay. And then we're going to start chapter 21, verses 1 through 15. Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, 'Let no one know anything about the matter which I am sending you and which I have commissioned you.' And I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now, therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found." The priest answered David and said, "There's no ordinary bread on hand, but there is a consecrated bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women." David answered the priest and said, "Surely women have been kept from us, as previously when I set out the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more than today will their vessels be holy?" So the priest gave them the consecrated bread, and there was no bread there, but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. Now, one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Dog the Edomite, and the chief of Saul's shepherds. David said to Ahimelech, "Now is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword or my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent." Then the priest said, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, who you killed in the valley of Elah, Behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it, for there is no other except it here. And David said, there is none like it, give it to me. Then David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, is not David the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath, disguised his sanity before them, and acted insanely in their hands, and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let saliva run down into his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen that you brought this one to act the madman in my presence? Shall this come into my house? All right, so a lot going on here, but basically while on the journey to escape the presence of Saul, David kind of stopped in and asked the priest Ahimelech to give him some bread. He gave him the false story that he's on this secret urgent errand for the king. And he also asked for some weapons. And kind of interesting is the only weapon that was available was the one-of-a-kind sword of Goliath. So he gets that. He travels on to this other land, and then out of fear that he's going to get, recognized and, either killed or sent to Saul or something along those lines, he decides he's just going to act crazy. So he just completely acts crazy here, and that works. He's kind of, the king wants nothing to do with him. All right, so David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam, and while his brothers and all his father's household heard of it, they went down there to him, everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in doubt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Now there was about 400 men with him, and David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me. And he left him with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. The prophet Gad said to David, do not stay in the stronghold, depart and go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was sitting in Gibeah under the tamarisk tree, on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. Saul said to his servants who stood around him, hear now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give to you all the fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servants against me to lie in ambush as it is this day. Then Doeg the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. He inquired of the Lord for him. He gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. All right, so David again must leave and travel, attempting to find a safe place. He escaped to the cave. His family met him there, as well as a bunch of others that were distressed and discontented. So it sounds like quite a group of people. He kind of became the leader of them. And after hearing from a prophet that he should depart, David, went into the forest. Saul heard that David and the men with him had been discovered, and then he, chastised his servants for not informing him of David's plan, and David and Jonathan's plan to let David escape. And we see this guy, this Edomite named Doeg, who I think that would be a descendant of Esau and not therefore an Israelite. That's what he told Saul that he had seen David receive provisions and Goliath's sword from the priest Ahimelech. So a lot going on here. Basically, we see though David's continuing to having to flee, to hide, just to not be killed. He's just continues to have to keep moving and going about, and it's a pretty good struggle that he's having here just to survive, basically. So Saul has definitely made things difficult for David. Okay, so verse 11, 1 Samuel 22. Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household, the priests who were in Nob. And all of them came to the king. Saul said, "Listen now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." Saul then said to him, "Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by line and ambush, as it is this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house? Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of his household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair." But the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household." Then the king said to the guards who were attending him, "Turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me." But the servants of the king, who were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, "You turn around and attack the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And he struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep he struck with the edge of the sword. Okay, so this priest Ahimelech, he gets called before Saul, and he tells him that he was unaware of this whole situation, that basically David had kind of told him this story, and he acted out of wisdom, since David was highly regarded as a faithful servant and even the king's son-in-law. But he didn't do anything wrong. But Saul, however, he just wants this vengeance for assisting his enemy, and he demands his guards to kill Ahimelech and his household. I mean, it's pretty stern punishment here for something that he didn't even know about. It just shows that Saul has kind of got this evil intent in his heart, and he's just willing to go to any end to destroy David. But even Saul's guards were unwilling to kill the priests of Yahweh God. They just basically refused to do it. Which is, when the king commands you to do something, if you're in his guard, you're supposed to do it. But they knew this was wrong, and they were not willing to do it. So Saul has, Doeg, this Edomite. He tells them to go kill him, and he, of course, didn't have any problem doing it. And he, basically massacres this whole family and everything, which pretty sad kind of story here. All right. 1 Samuel 23, verse 1. Then they told David, saying, "Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and they are plundering the threshing floors." So David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" And the Lord said to David, "Go and attack the Philistines and deliver Keilah." But David's men said to him, "Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more than if we go to Keilah against the ranks of the Philistines?" And then David inquired of the Lord once more. And the Lord answered him and said, "Arise and go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand." So David and his men went to Keilah and fought the Philistines, and he led away their livestock and struck them with a great slaughter. Thus David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. Now it came about when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. When it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, Saul said, "God has delivered him into my hand, for he shut himself in by entering a city with double gates and bars." So Saul summoned all the people for war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. Okay, so we see here that David received this word from God that he should go and fight the Philistines and protect and deliver this city from their attack of the Philistines. And David even confirmed it, make sure he's doing the right thing. God told him it was, so he went down there and delivered the people. You see that David is still trying to do what God wants him to. He's trying to help people. He's trying to follow God's will. so we see also, the son of Ahimelech was able to avoid being killed with his people, and he fled down to David. However, Saul also heard that David's there, and he's thinking that, which this is just crazy, but he was thinking that, Yahweh had delivered David into his hand. And it's just crazy that Saul is almost, delusional here, that he's the way he's thinking that God's still working to help him. But he called all his people to go down to war. He's like, I've got David now. He's in this city. He's going to be trapped in there. So Saul's thinking he's going to get him. So what we see again is, while God is actively, guiding David and protecting him, and even intervening in situations that, to help protect him from Saul, that Saul is, basically just still delusional at this point. And he thinks that, God is going to work to help him capture David. So I think this is kind of a strong warning here against, seeking one's own way contrary to God's way, since one can become deceived to the point of, just being delusional here, like what we see with Paul or to Saul here. So I think that's a warning for us, like make sure we're not just so caught up in our own way of thinking, and then that we are, we're just going to say this is our way, and then, project that as being God's intention when it really isn't. So something I think that we can pull forward, even applicable to us in modern times. Okay, verse 9 says, now David knew that Saul was plotting evil against him, so he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Then David said, O Lord God of Israel, your servant has heard for certain that Saul is seeking to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me to his hand? Will Saul come down just as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. Then David and his men, about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When it was told Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the pursuit. David stayed in the wilderness, in the strongholds, and remained in the hill country in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. Now David became aware that Saul had come out to seek his life when David was in the wilderness at Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Horesh and encouraged him in God. Thus he said to him, do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul, my father, will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul, my father, knows that also. So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and David stayed at Horesh while Jonathan went to his house. Okay, so here we see, God giving direction to David again, very clearly, on what's going to happen. So again, he departed and fled to avoid Saul. He had about 600 men. So it's a pretty good group of people here that David's got with him at this point. And he just keeps trying to avoid Saul. Saul's, pursuing him every day, just trying to kill him. And then we see this really cool here that, Jonathan finds out where he is and goes out to visit him and just to encourage him. And he even tells him, you're going to be the next king of Israel, rather than it being Jonathan, and that, Jonathan was going to be next to him there. So Jonathan is, fully aware at this point that God is protecting David and wants David to be the next king. And Jonathan is not going to try to intervene and put himself in that place. He's going to help David and bring about what God has decided here. He's going to support David as that next king of Israel. So really cool to see the contrast of character between Saul, who just is out for vengeance. He just got this hatred towards David, and he's going to go against God and anyone else to, harm David. While Jonathan, we see, being the son of Saul, he's got this character to, keep his word, to protect David, to encourage him, and that he's going to support God's plans for this. So really, really a wonderful contrast to see how even when you're right in the presence of someone who's out to do evil or the wrongdoing, that you can stand strong and do the right thing. All right, so verse 19, then Ziphites came up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, is not David hiding with us in the strongholds at Horesh on the hill of Hakilah, which is in the south of Jeshimon? Now then, O king, come down according to all the desire of your soul to do so, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand. Saul said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Go now, make more sure and investigate and see his place where his haunt is, and who has seen him there, for I am told that he is very cunning. So look and learn about all the hiding places where he hides himself, and return to me with certainty, and I will go with you, and if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah." Then they arose and went to Ziph before Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Man, and in the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon. When Saul and his men went to seek him, they told David, and he came down to the rock and stayed in the wilderness of Man. And when Saul heard it, he pursued David into the wilderness of Man, and Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul, for Saul and his men were surrounding David and his men to seize him. But a messenger came to Saul, saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid on the land." So Saul returned from pursuing David and went to meet the Philistines. Therefore, they called the place the Rock of Escape. David went up from there and stayed in the strongholds of Engedi. All right, and just more of the same thing. Saul just continued this pursuit, this relentless pursuit of David, and David just continues to flee. Here we see a narrow escape, just kind of because the Philistines decided to raid the land right when Saul's, trying to capture David. So Saul's got to go back and protect the land from the Philistines. So David gets away again. All right, and starting at chapter 24. Now, when Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, saying, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of Engedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the rock of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepfolds on the way, and where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of the cave. The men of David said to him, "Behold, this is the day which the Lord said to you, Behold, I am about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you." Then David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. It came about afterward that Saul's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. Now he said to his men, "Far be it from me because of the Lord that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed." David persuaded his men with these words, and they did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose and left the cave and went on his way. So, after pursuing the Philistines, Saul's right back to seeking David again. He goes back to the wilderness. And it's kind of an almost comical narrative here, but it says Saul left to go relieve himself in the cave, and just so happens, coincidentally, that David and his men were hiding in that very cave. And David's men are obviously like, "Wow, here's our chance. We stop all this pursuit. David can take care of Saul right here, and this is all going to be done with. We don't have to keep running and hiding and being in fear of our lives all the time." David, instead, though, he just cuts off the edge of the king's robe, and he was even troubled that he did that because he didn't want to harm Saul, because he had been anointed by God. So we can see the character here of David, that he does not want to do anything contrary to God's will, and since God had anointed Saul, he's unwilling to do anything against him. Starting at verse 8 now, it says, "And now afterward David arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, saying, 'My lord the king.' And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed his face to the ground and prostrated himself. David said to Saul, 'Why do you listen to the words of men, saying, Behold, David seeks to harm you? Behold, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord has given you into my hand in the cave. And some said to kill you, but my eye had pity on you, and I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Now my father, see the edge of your robe in my hand, for in that I cut off the edge of your robe and it did not kill you. Know and perceive that there is no evil or rebellion in my hands, and I have not sinned against you, though you are lying in wait for my life to take it. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancient says, out of the wicked comes forth wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog, a single flea? The Lord therefore judge and decide between you and me, and may he see and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. When David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, Is this your voice, my son David? Then Saul lifted up his voice and wept, and he said to David, You are more righteous than I, for you have dealt well with me, while I have dealt wickedly with you. You have declared today that you have done good to me, that the Lord delivered me into your hand, and yet you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safely? May the Lord therefore reward you with good in return for what you have done to me this day. Now behold, I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's household. David swore to Saul, and Saul went to his home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. Okay, so this is a really interesting, kind of change of events here, in that, after Saul exits the cave, David follows him out and calls after him and lets him know that if he had intention to harm Saul, then he could easily have completed it. He's got the part of Saul's robe in his hand. And he confronts Saul here for his attitude of thinking that David's his enemy. And in an interesting change there, it seems, at least for the time being, that Saul kind of appears to repent of his ill intention towards David, and he even declares that he's going to be king. And then Saul even asks that David not destroy his household and his descendants. And then, of course, David willingly complies with that, and that they kind of part their ways at this point. So, we've covered a lot of ground here and covered a lot of scripture. Just sometimes I like to just read a lot of scripture and let it speak for itself, instead of trying to, pick and choose little verses here and there. But some of the things after I've read through these, just the takeaway points that I saw that I thought were really something that we can kind of apply to ourselves now even. But I think this narrative shows us how Saul, he continued to try and destroy David, and God was working through the situation and through people to intervene. Similarly, I don't think we shouldn't be surprised if we find ourselves kind of persecuted by those in power, and God's still working in the situation. I think that's kind of the story throughout the whole Bible is, you do the right thing, and you're going to have some struggles because of it. But, basically, like we saw David here, keep doing the right thing, and God can kind of work through the situation, even when there's someone that's evil in power. Second thing was that, Saul, just in his envious mindset, he just went to this seemingly unreasonable amount of trouble in his pursuit of David. I mean, he just kept going after him. And it's just like this stubbornness and a disregard for righteous behavior that he had. Like he just would not realize that he was in the wrong here. This stubborn mindset, I think, is something that we should guard ourselves against and make sure we don't fall into a similar behavior. And then, when we're confronted with evidence that we're in the wrong, we should acknowledge it and repent. We saw Saul finally, it took him basically being realizing that he was very close to dying before he kind of got the wake-up call that he was in the wrong. But the stubbornness we saw, just him continuing to pursue David, and he wasn't willing to listen to his own son, Jonathan. He even tried to, throw a spear at his son, Jonathan, when he disagreed with him. So just that stubbornness is something that it's a human, like a human nature sometimes to be stubborn, to be set in our own ways. And I think there's a good example here for us to not do that. And the third thing was just looking at how Jonathan was this true friend of David. And although he stood to lose kind of the inheritance or the throne, he was still sought to protect David from his father. And we can look to his example as encouragement for us to seek, the behaviors that God would have us to do, even if it looks like it's going to cost us something. Sorry, there's a couple typos in there, I see. Yeah, I think some examples that we can kind of apply this to our own life and just look at kind of the ways that going through this, this narrative, you see kind of positive behaviors and we see negative behaviors, and there's examples in there for us to decide we want to act one way and not the other way. So that's kind of what I had to share this morning, but now we've got some time. We can open it up for discussion, comments. If you have any questions, I'll do my best. I know I probably didn't do so well pronouncing some of those names. I did my best though. But if you want to raise your hand or get my attention somewhere else, we'll just kind of go through in order. So Dean, you got your hand up, go ahead.
Well, what I see in this is that Saul is so much just like Satan because it was jealousy, was complete jealousy. Satan is jealous of mankind and certainly of Jesus Christ. And Saul was certainly jealous of David. And, just sick hearts. So that's what I see in that. I also see that Jonathan, I kind of posted that Jonathan was actually fulfilling the new commandment that we're talking about in John 13:34, to love one another, to lay your life down for another person. That's exactly what Jonathan did for David. And so I think those were the 2 points that I saw on that. And jealousy is a terrible thing. And it's not going to be good for Saul when he stands before Jesus Christ. He's going to melt. And it's just too bad, but what a jerk.
All right, thanks, Dean. Yeah, good thoughts there. Definitely see that, the influence there between, kind of the way Satan influences people to act evil and the way God influences people to be good. And there's a choice to be made there. So thanks for sharing that. Rosalind's next.
Yeah, hi. Well, the verse that I was reminded of from that whole incident is Matthew 5:38 and 39, where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, not resist the one who's evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." And then also Matthew 5:43 onwards. You've heard it was said, you should love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. And I think it's just so extremely beautiful the way that David's love and mercy and blessing on Saul is what leads Saul to repentance in that moment, although he continues later, but it actually has an effect in that moment because he repents and he weeps when he is blessed by David. And I just think that that's really beautiful, how the teachings of Jesus really, you can see how powerful love and mercy and blessing somebody can be. So those are my thoughts from that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rosalind. Yeah, and you pulled out some verses from Matthew, which I think that's a good way to tie things together, because obviously Jesus was the descendant of David. He was he's very frequently called the son of David, and I'm sure he was very familiar with his story and probably drew some encouragement for it when he was going through some tough times and being driven out by angry crowds and Pharisees and all. He could, look back at what David went through, and that was an encouragement for him. And yeah, really good. Go ahead, Jackson.
Yeah, so first off, I don't know how I didn't catch on to this sooner, but it dawned on me as you were reading through that passage that this is kind of like your quintessential where everybody pulls the story from for any kind of modern movie of the, underdog good guy leader who, is opposed by an evil leader and then kind of gathers a misfit crew of guys around him and then succeeds and kind of wins in the end, right? It's like, I'm like, wow, yeah, this is now I know where they got it all from. But anyway, I think I got reminded there's like one of the, I don't know, sometimes I'm scrolling YouTube and there was actually one that showed up this morning where there's those little shorts, which are usually just a bunch of TikTok crap, but it was an interview and a couple guys were commenting on faith and how you basically can't have faith if things are not uncertain, if there's not uncertainty, and you don't know what's going to happen in your life, right? And I think the intersection of that concept and the idea of having integrity is perfectly exemplified with David here, because I don't know, I think probably what a lot of us struggle with a lot of the time is that there's that that balance between uncertainty and having a feeling of control in your life, right? And all of us are usually readily available to take some control back whenever we have the opportunity to do so and restore extra certainty to our circumstances from whatever might be giving us stress or anxiety or whatever, right? And the line in the sand that David's situation here draws out for us is that when taking that control or granting yourself some sort of certainty would require you to do something wrong, then that's a clear indicator that it's not the way to go. And I just think it was really good that he had that level of integrity that, it's like everybody around him supports him. Everybody knows Saul's a bad guy. Everybody knows he's an evil, crazy dude. And probably the vast majority of people would just get right behind David and be like, let's make you king. But he didn't want to take the easy route and put himself in a position where even if all the people were behind him, God wouldn't have had it come out that way, right? And so he understood that if he sacrifices his integrity to make his life a little bit easier or more predictable or whatever, we don't know what would have happened. It would have been a slow collapse or something like Solomon if he had gone that way, right? But I don't know, it's just a really good example of how sometimes we have to embrace the uncertainty and keep trusting God that he's gonna turn things around or make the way or whatever it needs to be when things are tense and all that sort of stuff. And he just did a really good job at that. It's a good example.
Thanks, Jackson, for the comments there. That's good stuff. It's an interesting story when you go through there. I mean, there's a lot going on in this. I think a lot of times we tend to just read through sections like that and just kind of like, that's just history, but there's a lot that we can pull out of there. And I mean, just trying to put yourself in like what David must have been feeling and thinking in there, to me, is really powerful. And I feel like that's not an easy situation to be in. And I mean, I know probably a lot of people would say they have drama with their in-laws, but that's a whole nother level right there.
And that went on for years with David. years with Saul. My goodness.
Phyllis and Steve, you're next. Go ahead.
Hi. I've really gotten a lot from this, and I appreciate how you just went through it. You know, just it's like one of the best movies you could ever imagine. It's got everything in it. Kind of like what Jackson was saying. Everything you get to see, jealousy and pride and unfaithfulness. I mean, even down to the city that David helped to save because of fear and compromise. They were even willing to give him up when Saul confronted them. You got to see religion in practice when David's own men told him, the Lord said to you. But that was people telling him what the Lord had said to them. That's not what the Lord said to David. So we have to be real careful with that. And on the other hand, we got to see humility. We got to see obedience and especially faithfulness. David was faithful to God, and Jonathan was faithful to God and to David. You know, faithfulness is a big deal. God is a faithful God. And one of the other things you all were saying about how Dean had said this went on for years. And to me, that just speaks to the fact it's about continuing in the faith. It's not a one-time decision. It's a day by day. It's continuing in the faith. It's not it's a lifestyle. And this is what it showed me. I mean, David, so many situations came about when David could have changed his mind. He could have said, you know what, this is just too much. But he continued in the faith. He trusted God. And so this has really been good. And hey, I'm impressed with how you pronounced all those names. I'm glad it was you pronouncing them. But I really appreciate it. And when we go back and look at this again, I'll know I'll be looking at it with fresh eyes now and starting to really, things, you know, you just read over things sometimes, but it's a lot. This thing is packed. And thank you, Kenny. I appreciate it.
One thing to that is that in the kingdom is all about righteousness, and David was righteous throughout the whole ordeal.
Great comments, Phyllis and Steve, both. I mean, really good stuff. But I think what I like about going through kind of an Old Testament narrative like this is it is kind of more like, you know, like it's kind of a reference of a movie or something. You get to see all the different way things play out. Because I mean, all the points that we kind of can see here, those are all made in the New Testament. You know, you should be faithful, you should be honest, you should follow God's will, don't try to hurt people, don't try to kill people. But then you can see like a real life example of how this actually plays out in the, you know, the way that it's harmful to do it. So I think so much of Christianity, we sometimes avoid the Old Testament. We're like, oh, that doesn't apply to us so much today. But I mean, human nature hasn't changed, but it's the same things over and over again. So we see the same type of thing going on today and all through history. So I think it's really cool to see how God has always worked through people and to help people that are faithful to him. So, and one day we'll be in a wonderful kingdom where his will always takes place, and we don't have the Sauls chasing us around. So let's see that. I think the Pereiras were next.
Yeah, I like the way you have given the title, The Tale of Two Kings, and it really shows like how both of them were so different than each other. And one point I would like to draw out is about King Saul, how his conscience was so seared that he could not, differentiate between good and bad. Like he was even like by his mouth, he was saying things, okay, God has shown me this and God has done this, God has delivered David to me. And he's like, he was also demanding obedience from the people because of his position that God had chosen him as a king. But only thing that differed between him and David was, I could say, were their actions. When it came to the actions, like Saul even would kill the whole village, for his personal anguish, but then David wouldn't do that. And we see in the future also, when David's own son Absalom went against him, that he would not, he chose to flee away from the city because he did not want innocent people to die. And here, like Saul himself, like killed that too, God's, like the Levites, the priests. And that too, they were giving they were explaining him that we are not against you. They were confessing him that we didn't mean anything wrong to you, and still he did that. So in that way, he was he was in his mind, he was what is the word? I'm not getting the word. Like he's fully deceived. He was fully deceived that about, like, thinking that he's doing the right thing. But how we know that David was right? From his actions, he knew that he should not harm even the Lord's anointed, and he would not harm King Saul, even if it was given to him. Though he knew that he is going to be the next king, but he chose not to kill him. So,
Yeah, some really good points there, Seema. Some really good points for sure. It's the contrast there between Saul and David, like you brought up, it's pretty stark contrast. And you were talking there, it reminded me of, it was just a couple of these back in the series we read about Saul getting chosen to be king and kind of initiated into that, and how he seemed to, at least at that time, have a little bit of humility and have a little bit of willingness to follow God. And God hand chose Saul to be the king. He had potential, but it kind of went to his head, and he kind of went down the path the wrong way, and then then he became stubborn and just hard-hearted and just continued to go that way. He should have repented long ago, earlier, before this, but he just went down that path. And I think it can kind of show the further you go the wrong direction, the harder it is to turn away and to repent sometimes. But it can be kind of a warning to always be on guard for us to be checking ourselves against what God would have us do, and say, are we in line with his will and such. So yeah, thanks for sharing those thoughts, Seema. Yeah, Jackson, go ahead.
Yeah, another thing that I got reminded of as we've been talking that came up in my mind is in the scene where Jonathan and David have kind of their like parting strategy with the arrows and the lad and all that stuff. And it reminded me of, well, first it made me think that's kind of something that situation in a way is almost kind of like introducing a 10-year-old to a rotary telephone in a way, right? Because that sort of circumstance that they found themselves in sort of doesn't really exist anymore in the world, right? Like, of course, we can be physically parted. That's how all of us here end up surviving and using technology to overcome that problem. But I was instantly thinking to myself, like, what would this be like nowadays? Like, they'd have cell phones, they'd be text messaging all the way along. There wouldn't need to be any sort of secret message system necessarily. And then if David ran away, he'd have to like delete all his social media to actually be able to hide from King Saul. And it's just really interesting to kind of pick it apart and kind of put yourself back into that world where you're, things are a little bit less complicated, but also it creates these problems where you can actually have like true separation from people, right? And anyway, that reminded me, thinking of that, of how important it is to have close friendships, like tight bonded friendships with people, and how valuable it is, because I'm just putting myself in David's shoes and thinking like, how much harder would it have been for him to keep his composure and his commitment to doing what's right if he didn't have like just hardcore like-minded brotherhood, moral support from his friend Jonathan, who, being the son of the guy who wants to kill him, is with him, right? Because it's like, just think, if some of us are more, hard-headed and of our own way, and then others of us are more influenced by the thoughts and opinions of others, and want to be liked and all that sort of stuff. We all want that to some degree. So it just got me thinking, like, how valuable is it to have somebody who validates the decisions you're making and the commitments you're making and the perspective you have, when the most powerful person in the whole country is against you, right? It's like, could we imagine, imagine often the UK or in India or here, it's like the president or the prime minister wants to kill you or wants to imprison you for the rest of your life and you've done nothing wrong. And then nobody's with you to say, oh, he's just wrong, this is going to turn around for you, versus having somebody that's like the son of the person that's after you saying, no, I'm with you, he's off in this, right? It's like, how powerful is that to keep you sane even in the situation? So, and I'm just recollecting times in my life where I've had in the same city a close Christian brother that I can share faith with and encourage and be encouraged by, and it's just a really powerful thing. So it reminds me of that.
Thanks for sharing that, Jackson. That's something too that I hope people would see from this kind of narrative going through here, is that bond and how between Jonathan and David, how that kind of helped him to go through those difficult times. It reminds me that whenever I read that section about Jonathan and David, there's a verse in Proverbs that comes to mind. It says, "A man of too many friends comes to ruin, but there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother." And I think Jonathan is definitely that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what always comes to my mind, is that verse. So, Jonathan was that friend that sticks closer than a brother. I mean, David's brothers weren't out hanging out with him. Doesn't say anything in there about it. Jonathan went out to the wilderness and encouraged him. So I have to wonder if that was maybe referencing when Proverbs was written, if that was maybe looking back and thinking of that relationship between Jonathan and David. I don't know, but it always makes me wonder that.
I'm wondering if there was some jealousy among his brothers, David's brothers, because he's the youngest and yet he's the king to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they didn't treat him real well before we read about it with him going out there. So yeah, Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, it was just a personal reflection, because I'm at the beginning of this journey into the biblical Unitarianism, and in chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, when it says David escaped to the cave of Adullam, and he gathered to himself everyone who was in distress, and everyone who's in debt, and every man that was in bitterness of soul, and he became king over them, and there were with him about 400 men. It was a personal kind of identification with that, being in distress and despair, and yet the comfort that it's like David as a type of the Lord, gathering this small band and elect to himself, and it just feels a bit like this is to me, it's like a cave of Adullam. I'm scurrying off. This is the first week that my wife's gone to church, and I've gone somewhere else, which is just so massive. And Yeah, I just thought about the number 400 as well. Isn't that in other places in the Bible? That's the number of the false prophets, and it's like, it's almost like there's this little David's little band of mighty men to fight the false message that's out there, even though it's the mainstream message. It's like we're outnumbered 400 to 1. But yeah, just some personal reflections there. I don't know if anybody else kind of saw that or not.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Sean. It's good. Yeah, when I was reading through that, it's like he gathered the people that were, distressed, in debt, bitter in soul. I mean, most of us would be like, how would you like to hang out with 400 guys that are bitter in soul and in debt and distressed? Probably kind of a lot of complaining, irritation going on in that group. So you get to be like, you want to be commander of all the people that are, distressed and in debt and bitter in soul. So probably but I mean, I think probably everyone in that situation, being in, kind of a tough spot in a sense, they probably found a way to encourage each other and were united in that way. And, probably was, those people were probably felt like, okay, we fit in here. We're all in the kind of the same trouble and we can encourage each other. And, and then they of course had David as their leader, who, as we read previously, David just, every time he's given any type of leadership thing, he just does a great job at it. He's just got like that, with the God guiding him, and he's got the skills of that, of leading the armies in the past. Like they probably couldn't have found a better person to align themselves with. So I would have to imagine those people probably had some life-changing things happen after being with David for however long this, band held together. All right, well, I think that's everyone had their hand up. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of close out the recording here. So anyone that's watching this and didn't get to join us, we'd really love to have you join us in person so we could discuss things with you. And there's more that goes on besides what's on the recording. We pray for each other and have other conversations and all. So we'd love you to be part of that. Check out the description of the video to get the details on how to do that.